Thanks for coming back now to Colonial Worlds and Women's Lives, 1607 to 1750. This is the fourth installment now of the big lecture on colonial America and women's lives in the century and a half preceding the American Revolution. So much that is foundational, even about the American nation as we know it today, is coming together in this long colonial century and a half. We tend to telescope it, as I mentioned earlier, as if it were just the blink of an eye, but many generations of people, of women, of European and African and Native background were born and lived and died in this long colonial era. And so no wonder that much of what becomes foundational then for the American nation we find transpiring throughout this time. And this is certainly true of our final part now in the lecture, part 4, as we take a look at New England, the region that comes to be colonized and named New England by the same investors, same political elites in England who had basically imagined, envisioned, and invested in the colonizing of the Chesapeake Bay region. So, like Virginia, the same visions of empire sparked the colonization of New England, and we even see here a familiar face, that of Captain John Smith, who affixed his name and image to the writing of the first history of New England, just as he had that of Virginia. So lots of connections here between the English settlements of the Chesapeake and that of New England. And yet there's something about New England and its history and its foundation that has always struck us as different, perhaps, in our history. At the same time, however, as indentured servants and enslaved people formed migration of the unfree across the Atlantic world, so too did a different type of English migration track across the Atlantic to the region called New England during the 1620s, 30s, and 40s. And you can see from the illustration here that these various streams of migration bringing not only English folk, but ultimately to servant folk and eventually even enslaved people to populate the English colonies. So these migrations are all going on more or less at the same time. And that of New England will be yet a bit different than the others. New England's actual settlement, to be distinguished from its charter and its essential blueprint of investors, the actual settler folk now who come will be inspired in many cases by a utopian vision of religious community that we sometimes call Puritanism. And so Puritans and Puritanism will be a part of this lecture today that I will endeavor to explain to you. So not just motivated by the same impulses of Christian conquest that we saw in Ireland and in the Chesapeake, but now an even more refined or utopian vision of religious community that is built around the migration of entire families. That is, English settler folk, not simply indentured servants or wealthy landowners, but actual settler folk will be also part of that migration of English people to New England, many of whom are not large or wealthy landowners, but rather small property owners, that is, farmers, sometimes as artisans or even shopkeepers, migrating to New England now as part of a larger wave of migration from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Atlantic world, but imprinted, as I say, from the beginning with a kind of religious vision that was further refined from the settlements of the Chesapeake Bay. As one promoter of this Puritan migration put it, if men desire to have a people degenerate speedily and to corrupt their minds and bodies too, let them seek a rich soil that brings in much with little effort or labor. But if they desire that piety and godliness should prosper, let them choose a country such as New England, which may yield sufficiency with hard labor and industry. Well, now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't exactly sound like a promotional pitch for migration to New England. Hard labor and industry would be required to wring from the ground a basic sustenance, given that the soils of New England were decidedly inferior to those of Virginia, and the variations in climate even greater in Massachusetts, with long and bitterly cold winters, made the life of settlers even more arduous and difficult. And yet this is an idea the Puritans will embrace. That is, the religious folk we call Puritans, that English Protestants with a specific notion of their own communities and historical commitments to biblical Christianity as they saw it, will embrace the hardship and rigors of life in New England as part of their own religious test of commitment, if you will, their own commitment to their religious covenants. Well, what was this New England so-called? Well, these were English settlements mixed into a Native American heartland. And just as the Algonquin communities of the Chesapeake had predated and organized the lands of what became Virginia and Maryland, so too now will the peoples of the eastern woodlands, the native peoples of the eastern woodlands, likewise hold sovereignty over much of that region for many generations before the arrival of the English. And you can pick out some of the tribal names that will lend themselves in many cases to the naming of towns and cities and that sort of thing. From the Pocumtucks to the very southern edge here, you see the Mohawks of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Mohegans, the Pequots, etc., the Wampanoags. These are the native tribal peoples that predominate throughout the region the English will call New England. And here you see, just within the reach of Cape Cod Bay, the little town named for a town in England, Plymouth, will be that first and fabled settlement by Puritans, that specific group of Puritans that we label Pilgrims. And they will be the first in 1619, and then over the next decade, others of similar religious stripe will follow them. Many of these subsequent settlements of Puritan settlers will be here in the area around what becomes the city of Boston and Charleston. So sort of radiating outward from these coastal stretches will be the Puritan settlements that define New England. Instead of seeing this wilderness, as they like to call New England, instead of seeing it as a place of natural beauty, the Puritans tended to view it almost with distrust as a forest primeval, a place void of Christian civilization. As one of them, the governor of the Pilgrim colony at Plymouth, William Bradford, put it, a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men. So even less charitable in their appraisal of the local native people than their comrades in the Chesapeake, the Puritans, the English Puritans, fundamentally distrusted the various place that they now presumed to settle, which made their religious commitment and vision even more important. Because if they were going to bring God's light, that is the Christian gospel, to a dark heathenish land, they would have to stick together and maintain their covenants every step of the way. And they would establish, by and large, rather than great plantation fields, small villages. That is, most immigrants to New England settled in villages along the coastline, beginning with Plymouth, and then sort of along the coastline of New England, a succession of towns and villages that over time, some would grow large as merchant ports such as Boston. Some of them stay relatively small, like Salem. And Salem is famous in American history for the witch trials that were held there in 1692. Salem was a Puritan town. Those involved with the witch trials were by and large Puritans. And it perhaps helps to understand the fear of witchcraft and the outbreak, the hysteria associated with the Salem trials, when you consider once again that many Puritans considered these lands to be already possessed of some sort of demonic or evil spirit in the dark forests and in the habits and customs of those native peoples who they considered to be heathenish and savage. So again, it's a kind of collision of different cultures, English, Puritan, Native, American, that will lead to very pronounced conflicts, not only the Salem trials famously, but great wars between the Puritans and the native peoples. And so forming these tight-knit little villages, often bounded by a defensive perimeter for the better defense of their interests, this becomes the seedbed, really, of the growth of New England and the future colonies of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut and later New Hampshire and eventually even Maine that make up the New England region. According to its organizers, this region was to be a new England, that is, distinguished from the old England that they had left behind and which many of the Puritans considered impure, including the Church of England and what they had come to believe, generally speaking, was a rather sinful and corrupt version of a Christian society. And thus many Puritans were inspired by the religious zeal of implanting true Christian community in the wilderness of America. And the first of these, as I say, the first successful small colonies of these Puritan immigrants was the Plymouth colony under the leadership of William Bradford, who we come to call the Pilgrims. William Bradford recalled that once they'd reached land, these Plymouth colonists, and they chose the name Plymouth because it was emblematic of their home back in England. Bradford recalled they, quote, fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on firm and stable earth, their proper element. And it was this scene of arrival, the succeeding hardships that followed, and ultimately the success of the colony that led to perhaps America's most famous mythology, the mythology of Thanksgiving, which is often cited as the beginning, the true beginning of American history. Well, okay, you see the Thanksgiving ideal captured here by the 20th century painter Norman Rockwell, with all its scenes of down-hominess and family and folks brought together. You even see that Rockwell sneaky as he was, painted himself in the corner, as it were, looking at the camera, with the matriarch and the patriarch presiding over the bountiful harvest. Well, just as I think in my own personal experience, this Norman Rockwell vision of Thanksgiving is mostly fictional, so too is the very idea of an American Thanksgiving connecting back to the Pilgrims, also largely fictional. Certainly in this artist's conception, I think that mythology is captured, showing native peoples and English Puritans, though note the presence here of a soldier. Would that be John Smith? One's not sure. Sharing together a bountiful harvest in terms of friendship and harmony. This is all basically rubbish. It comes from a story told by Bradford and some of the other pilgrims of an actual meal held with some local natives, but like most mythologies, it makes completely disproportionate the actual event to the larger scheme of what was going on in New England. And as it turns out, much of New England's early history is steeped in these kinds of mythologies. There was no more easy harmony between the English and the native people of New England than there was of the Chesapeake. And just as the English settlers of the Chesapeake pretended to have no real interest in making alliances with native people, let alone friendships, or even converting them to Christian religion, neither did the Puritans. Remember, the Puritans and the Pilgrims are included now in the larger Pilgrim or Puritan migration. The Pilgrims and the Puritans believed this region to be possessed of substantial evil, mostly as it was manifest in the lives of the native people. So rather than seeing them as allies or friends or even potential converts, the Puritans of New England took pretty much the same view toward native people as did their countrymen in the Chesapeake. That is, one of removal and vanquishment. Oh, and by the way, the Thanksgiving holiday wasn't even proclaimed, as you know, until the middle of the 19th century. So more than, 200 years had passed since the purported event itself, and that had been plenty of time to turn the history into mythology. And yet, the interesting thing about mythologies isn't that they exist or even that they're historically, inaccurate. I think the more interesting part about mythologies is why we so often cling to them and embrace them. What it is we are trying to say about our own self-image or vaunted ideals by referencing constantly the image of a bountiful harvest, a friendship between English settlers and native people, why it is important to us as a nation that we somehow maintain that mythology. Because when we look more closely at the historical facts of the case, what we see are mythologies, again, layered like the layers of an onion. And you start pulling them away, and what you find out is that they are thin and transparent, much like the skin of an onion. And truthfully, probably smell just as bad upon close inspection. We sometimes say, in fact, we frequently say, in fact, students of mine, some of you will still insist upon saying, even if I painstakingly try to provide a corrective, that somehow America's true origins lie in the arrival of these New England immigrants who were here to escape religious persecution back home in England, number one, and to establish religious freedom and freedom more generally, number two, here in the New World. Well, if those two statements are at the core of our mythology, then I hope you won't be too disappointed to learn that neither of them are actually true. The Puritans were not chased out of England, not persecuted away from the island in which they had been born. They freely chose, they voluntarily chose, in the face of what was generally fairly light religious disfavor in their country, and nor were they interested whatsoever in forming what we would call today the foundations of freedom, whether it be religious freedom or liberty generally, here on the shores of North America. Let me just take a pause here to give you time to recover. If you fainted and fell on the floor, maybe some smelling salts applied. Can you bring you back to the lecture now? Look, to put it simply, the Puritans believed that man was naturally inclined towards sin. That is, in their religious beliefs, they held a strict Calvinist interpretation of the fall of man and believed that man, ever since Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, that man was naturally inclined towards sin, and that thus freedom, even freedom of religious belief, was a prescription simply to produce errors and evils more akin to the devil than an all-powerful God. That sort of mistaken religious belief was evil and seen as heresy and can bring destruction down on the Puritan errand into the wilderness. In other words, not only were the forests of New England full of evils, but so too did the Puritans believe were men's hearts. And if man were left to live freely according to his own passions, then inevitably the doctrine of original sin would predict evil and heresy would follow. And the leader of the largest Puritan migration, John Winthrop, who would later become governor of Massachusetts Bay. Winthrop, in a kind of lay sermon called A Model of Christian Charity in 1630, pretty much laid it all out. That is, what the actual vision of the Puritans would be. He said, "We are entered into covenant with him for this work. He ratified this covenant and sealed our commission, and will expect a strict performance of the articles contained in it. But if we shall neglect the observation of these articles, which are the ends we have propounded, and, dissembling with our God, shall fail to embrace this present world and prosecute our carnal intentions, seeking great things for ourselves and our posterity, the Lord surely will break out in wrath against us and be revenged of such a people and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant." This was the famous sermon in which Winthrop proclaimed that the Puritans would be as a city upon a hill. And God knows that politicians have used that phrase ever since as a kind of trumpet of American nationalism, a presumed American greatness, a city upon a hill. But that's not at all what John Winthrop meant. And if you look carefully at his words here, this is a kind of warning basically to the Puritan settlers that they had a covenant, a kind of legal contract with their God. And if they were to break that contract, to break that covenant, and live according to what he calls here the strict performance of it, that God would wreak vengeance on the Puritans themselves, as he said, would break out in wrath against us and be revenged of such a people. This was no time to allow religious freedom. This was a time to enforce religious conformity according to the strict Calvinist precepts of the Puritans. And as their history will show again and again, whenever different views, whenever pleas for tolerance and diversity found their way into colonies like Massachusetts especially, the reaction was swift and harsh. They were not interested in religious diversity or religious toleration, but instead that utopian Christian vision based on their biblical understanding of what the pure faith itself would be. And anyone who begged to differ, anyone who suggested otherwise, would have to be either banished from the colony or worse, as we'll see in our next lecture. So yeah, American mythologies, we're peeling them away like layers on an onion skin. These Puritan families that Winthrop was referencing here were meant to be like little commonwealths. And commonwealth is not a term we hear too much now. It's both a political and a legal term that refers to the common weal or the general good of a community. So these Puritan families were really the kind of nuclear center, the nucleus, if you will, of the Puritan society. As William Gouge put it in 1622, a little church and a little commonwealth. It is a school wherein the first principles and government are subjection are learned. The first principles of government and subjection are learned. The family was like a little government unto itself, and this model of government saw husbands ruling over wives, parents ruling over children, and masters ruling over servants, including slaves, as we'll see, within the family government. A kind of parallel or mirror to the rulers governing subjects in the larger state, or the ministers governing over a congregation in the Puritan churches. In other words, this was a worldview predicated upon authority and duty and obedience, especially patriarchal authority, that is, authority stemming from leading male authorities. This was not, in any sense of the word, an individualistic, democratic society full of diversity and toleration, or liberty, as it would come to be known in the American Revolution. As I say, a Christian utopia of tight-knit villages, Christian communities centered on families, and the patriarchal authority of fathers. Gender hierarchy and moral liberty, you might say, not freedom, not even religious freedom. As I said already, freedom was equated with license. That is a corrupt and unchristian tendency towards sin, which was the opposite of what the Puritans called moral liberty. Moral liberty came with all kinds of restrictions and duties and obligations. And that included within the family, the relations between husband and wife. Coming from the common law tradition of England, the great commentaries on the laws of England by William Blackstone. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. Now, this is a portrait of John Winthrop, and John Winthrop, who will become the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, echoed the thoughts of William Blackstone in his writings and in his preachings. He was himself not a church minister, but what we would call a lay preacher, if you will. That is, a person of the church who, because of his wealth and good reputation, served as a kind of moral steward for his congregation. And when we hear Winthrop talk about the Puritan marriage, we hear the echo of William Blackstone. The woman's own choice makes a man her husband, yet being so chosen, he is her lord, and she is to be subject to him, yet in way of liberty, not of bondage. And a true wife accounts her subjection her honor and freedom, and would not think her condition safe and free, but in her subjection to her husband's wishes. Now, being as we are accustomed to a more individualistic concept of the marriage relation, that is, as men and women enter into companionate marriage today, retaining all of their various legal rights as individuals. In John Winthrop's day, that was a danger to be avoided. Again, that kind of freedom, that kind of liberty was prone to license and wrong behavior and ultimately chaos. The Puritan conception, which echoed William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, suggested that a woman and a man could freely enter into marriage. There was a sense of moral agency here that was embedded in their views of Christian moral agency. But once in the marital bond, as Winthrop says, a wife became the subject of her husband. And this patriarchal duty and obedience to obey her husband was a very sort of cornerstone of the Puritan experiment and the Puritan community. So women had an interesting kind of standing here. They were central to the conception of Puritan community as wives and mothers naturally, and they played a critical role in upholding the standards, then moral and otherwise, of that community. This gave them both certain privileges and authority, but also great responsibility, seeing as how those Puritan villages were built around so many family economies and family labor. Women naturally held a certain status, a practical status, as one historian has referred to them as deputy husbands. And that's because so much of the daily labor, so much of daily life depended on the labors of the Puritan wife. One English visitor to the colony in the 1600s wrote, "Virginia thrives by keeping many servants, and these in strict obedience. New England conceives that they and their children can do enough, and so they have rarely above one servant." And this comment, this observation, is both accurate and a bit misleading, because while it is true in New England you don't see a servant population ultimately reaching the size of, say, that of the Chesapeake, and certainly even a slave population reaching the size of the Chesapeake by the 1700s. That is not to say that either servants or slaves were absent from New England. I'll have more to say about that in a minute, but it does point out that there was a sort of ethic of self-sufficiency within the Puritan family. And yes, a Puritan family might have a servant or two as part of the household, but by and large it was the authority of the husband as well as the kind of adjunct authority of the wife that made the Puritan family a kind of economy unto itself. These were settler folk, after all, who by and large were not ambitious in the way that the William Byrds of Virginia, that is, the great tidewater planters of Virginia, were ambitious. They certainly were not averse to profit or even the collecting of property, the acquiring of property, but they had a certain, I suppose you could say, ethic of modesty that saw them, at least in these villages and towns, as having a kind of communal responsibility to the greater good of the town or the community, at least in the first couple of generations of New England settlement. And thus, women within those families held a kind of religious and spiritual and communal authority. Some have gone so far as to suggest that husband and wife, though separated in law by patriarchy, were in religious bounds, at least spiritual, equal. And this was also reflected in the laws. It was permissible, for example, in England, for a woman to divorce her husband if her husband, for example, had been found guilty of adultery or abandonment. And this was a somewhat more liberal arrangement than other parts of the old world, where divorce was essentially not a legal option of a woman. It was restricted in New England, but some historians point to it to suggest that there was more of that sort of spiritual and perhaps legal equality in the Puritan marriage. Certainly, one Puritan woman of her time, of the 17th century, Anne Bradstreet, who wrote poetry in verse, seemed to express a kind of almost romantic or companionate ethic in referencing here her husband, a letter, as this poem was entitled, a letter to her husband absent upon public employment. And if you read the lines, you'll see that this is a woman who's missing her husband, who's away on business, and she misses him because he's her friend, he's her companion. She has a love for him that somehow completes her in the union of their marriage. So there is evidence, like the poems of Anne Bradstreet, that suggests that Puritan wives and Puritan mothers were able to create a kind of, loving bond or loving covenant between the members of the family. Under the auspices, always, of course, of that kind of Christian forbearance and Christian meekness of spirit. And this also translated into parental roles, especially motherhood and childbirth. We see yet another Anne Bradstreet poem here from 1656. She was part of these first generations of Puritan settlers in New England, who is writing a poem here, an interesting one. I'll let you read it on your own, that both sort of waxes romantic about her large family. She says, "I had 8 birds hatched in the nest, 4 girls and 4 boys," and talks about the hardships of raising children as a Puritan mother, but also the pleasures of it. But then the mixed feelings coming when the children come of age and move out onto their own. I'll let you decide whether she was celebrating that fact or actually grieving over it. But a clever kind of turn here by Anne Bradstreet in her poem on motherhood. And you see here one of the famous portraits of the Puritan family, showing Elizabeth Clark Freak and her young daughter by an unidentified artist in 1674, which again shows, I suppose, the not only the maternal bond of Puritan women, but also the central place of mothers and daughters in the hearth and home of Puritan families. So really idealizing, again, the Puritan family as the kind of nucleus or nuclear center of society. And so I think we can credit to the Puritans a kind of idealizing of the family, a kind of even sentimentalizing and romanticizing of the family as the sort of moral ground zero of a society. You didn't quite see that, remember, in Virginia, where you had a demographic disparity, too many men, not enough women in the early years. Those women that were there were servants, and thus, sort of lived under the stigma of being dispossessed and often vagrant, subject to sexual assaults and that kind of thing. And it's not until you get the gentility, the culture of gentility, as the wealth accrues in Virginia. But even then, the depictions of family, were more built around the status consciousness. Someone like William Byrd's daughter, Evelyn Byrd, that we saw in the earlier part of this lecture. She's depicted a solitary figure, for one, more of an ornament of beauty and family status than that kind of internal family bond. So we can find sort of different variations of expression here, where women's lives as mothers and as daughters are concerned in these English settlements of early America. It's hard to say any one thing about early women in early colonial America. Certainly, it's not true that prosperity was universal among these hardworking Puritans. Prosperity did not extend to every family as the economy of Massachusetts grew increasingly commercial by the late 1600s and into the 1700s. The problems of poverty, for example, came to the fore. In Boston, poor relief expenditures, that is, money given by the government, by the state, to the care of dispossessed and impoverished people grew and, in fact, doubled between 1740 and 1760. This was the result of a number of factors: imperial wars, rising unemployment, as I say, the vulnerability to the boom and bust cycle of an increasingly commercial and transatlantic economy led to a growth in urban poverty. So, as much as the Puritans wished to see themselves and wished to foster this notion of the self-sustaining, self-sufficient, tight-knit Puritan family, Puritan society ultimately was the threads of Puritan society were undone by the pressures of growth and the labor pains of expansion and the attending problems that came with it. So a bit more complicated picture of early New England than that of the simple Puritan farmhouse. Such as are proper objects of the charity of this town, said one Boston almshouse keeper in 1713. What he's talking about here, the proper objects of the charity of this town, we would today call homeless people. So yeah, Puritan New England had their share. Nor did the Puritan claims of family as Puritan New Englander extend to everyone, as Puritan New Englanders purchased slaves who had been torn from their natural families and thus supported and participated in the West Indies and Atlantic slave trade that was responsible for millions of families destroyed by enslavement. In other words, somewhere in the midst of all the crowing about the godly Christian Puritan family, somewhere in there, maybe reading between the lines, we find the same old reality of enslavement that we see in the other colonies of the early English settlements, including those that we've looked at, such as the Chesapeake of Virginia. Now, you don't have the same plantation cash crop farming economy in New England, so you don't have the same numbers, although it's worth pointing out that there were just as many enslaved people in New England by the 1650s as there were in Virginia. What you don't see in New England is that great takeoff, that exponential increase to the expansion of the tobacco economy that you see in Virginia. But nevertheless, slavery is there, and in many ways, the Puritan family and Puritan society was just as intricately interwoven into the slave trades of the Atlantic world and into slave owning as anywhere else. As one historian references it, as the interlocked gears of colonization and enslavement. Wendy Warren, the historian, writes, a defining feature of chattel slavery continued to be separation of kin according to the vagaries of the market. And what she's referring to here is that for every slave purchased by a Puritan family to live as an enslaved servant within the household, be it a rural family or a town or even a city family, for every one of those individuals, another family somewhere else was torn apart, because every single one of those persons enslaved had been born, of course, to different parents, at least different mothers, probably in different places across the West Indies, or maybe even in Africa, where they had been taken, stolen, kidnapped, bartered, sold into the Atlantic slave trade. And so for all their talk of the sanctity of the family, the Puritans had absolutely no hesitation in exploiting the availability of enslaved persons as laborers and servants, even though it meant fostering an institution that wreaked havoc with millions of families over time, across the Atlantic world. Yeah, once again, an enslaved mother's status in New England sealed the fate of her child, and her lack of powerlessness and lack of parental rights made a mockery of the Puritan family ideal. Uh, Sometimes enslaved women bore children whose fathers had been other enslaved men, but even this was criminalized. This was love being criminalized. If two enslaved persons became attached and had a child, it was still outside the bounds of formal marriage. This was considered a sin by the Puritans. The name they gave to it, of course, was fornication, and usually one or both of the parties was threatened either with whipping and or fines that their owners would have to pay. Although it's not shown that enslaved pregnant women would be whipped, it is known that once they deliver their child, the penalty of whipping could indeed be meted out. So a double standard here, since the bonds of family did not apply to the families of enslaved persons, and the status of enslavement followed from that of the mother, just as it did in Virginia and elsewhere. In another way, however, the Puritans felt they were being entirely consistent because, according to their own racial and theological reasoning, enslaved people could not fully partake of the covenant of marriage as free agents, free moral agents who covenant with one another. They couldn't do that because they were somebody's property. They were not given the legal or social acknowledgement of being free persons, and therefore it was sort of conveniently defined, you might say, in New England, that the laws of Christian forbearance did not apply to them because they were not allowed by law or custom to benefit from and be protected by the covenant of marriage. New England's larger economy shared the same network of commodities and trade that defined the Atlantic world and its global outreach. Yes, it's true, for the first 2 generations or so, most of that economy was built around the more local town economies of New England, but very, very quickly, in historical terms, those town economies integrated into the larger networks of the Atlantic economies, and towns like Boston became very wealthy and prominent shipping and trading cities within that larger network. But it pays to remember then that New England farmers, fishermen, merchants, and shippers, Puritans all, provided the beef and pork and peas and fish and tar and pitch and furs and even slaves that kept the cash crop economy of the West Indies, and we might as well add the Chesapeake, going, kept them operating. Without those resources supplied by New England, so in demand in those plantation colonies, the entire operation of the West Atlantic economy, the economy of the Atlantic world with its global outreach, could not have successfully maintained, and thus brought great wealth to the Puritans of New England, a great wealth that was wrung from the sweat of enslaved people's labor throughout the Western Hemisphere. So one final bit of mythology peeled away from the colonial history of New England, that these Puritans, as moral exemplars of a new order, were somehow immune to the material ambitions or even the consequences of slavery and the expansion of a slave-based economy. They were, as we might say, up to their eyeballs in it, even if their relationship to it was perhaps different than that of the tidewater planters of the Chesapeake. All right, so that's going to finish now our lecture on colonial world and women's lives. I have one more lecture for you in this unit. We'll call it a little bump lecture, one of my faves, called Disorderly Women. So you're going to have to come back and check out that next lecture to see what that's all about as we complete the first part of our course.